if. It's a question of when. It's a question of timing. As Scott mentioned when he was just telling us, that looks likely for late spring. But that's kind of the timeline that the special counsel has been envisioning all along. In papers they've filed, they've said they basically wanted to have this issue on immunity resolved by the summer so that they could have a trial.
Robert Costa is with us. He's our election and campaign correspondent. Not if, but when. When matters politically, and this will land in the middle of what is still a battle for the Republican nomination. I know the Trump team likes to say it's effectively over. Nikki Haley is still there, but this does create a reality around this question of, yes, you're going to go before the bar. You're going to be tried on these underlying charges.
Major, former Ambassador Haley's allies tell me they believe she can make a more coherent argument in the coming weeks that Trump will face the specter of these legal challenges, but they're not convinced privately that it will be enough for her to start to gain traction in those Super Tuesday contests coming up in March, let alone her home state, South Carolina, later this month. But more broadly, Republicans are growing increasingly concerned that with a federal trial on January 6th now likely looming on the horizon, that could be a burden to Republicans nationwide down ballot who want to be talking about the economy, talking about the border, but instead we'll be talking about January 6, 2021.
And President Biden has leaned in aggressively in the last couple of months about the stakes involved in this election. And one of the stakes, he says, is our institutional norms. Now, 2 courts have said this suggestion that a president is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution is something that fits into that question of institutional norms.
It does fit into that question, but for the White House and the Biden campaign, this is a complicated moment because the Justice Department is moving forward with its prosecution, and politically they can only say so much, if anything, about that.
Jan, real quick.
Well, you know, I mean, this is not a frivolous argument. I mean, Trump is making a kind of a really broad argument, but the issue of immunity is not a frivolous one. There are key reasons why presidents shouldn't be subject to criminal immunity for actions while they're in office, and that's where this court is drawing the line. So I think that, you know, going forward, we will see again, maybe the full D.C. Circuit, the Supreme Court rejecting those broad arguments.
Jan and Bob,
but Trump still has to show up in a trial. Right. And that's why this is a difficult issue in the middle of a campaign.
No question. Jan and Bob, hold on 1 second. I want to bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, the Trump attorneys had argued that what he did around January 6th in the 2020 election lived and existed, in their words, in the outer perimeter of presidential responsibilities and therefore should be given some legal deference, their terminology, immunity. Not 1, but 2 courts have now rejected that, the import of that.
Well, I think, as Jan was saying here, it's not an absurd argument, but the precedents point in a different direction. What you look at, and we're going through this 57-page per curiam opinion, which is astonishing in and of itself. They spoke with one voice. What they're saying is that criminal cases are different. Yes, we have concluded that when it comes to civil cases and official acts, presidents do enjoy absolute immunity. But what this opinion begins with right off is that criminal cases are different. Criminal investigations are different. We have to be allowed to let those proceed. That's in the public interest. They cite to cases involving subpoenas of the former president right off the bat. And I agree with Jan. I think that there's no way you can count to 5 to have this Supreme Court look at its precedent, look at this broad argument and say, yes, we are going to bless this. Because it's not just about President Trump. It's about every president moving forward and whether or not we want to create that type of precedent in our legal system. The court here unequivocally said no for a whole host of reasons.
I want to go back to the federal courthouse here in Washington, D.C., and our Scott McFarland. Scott, you mentioned a moment ago about what this may or may not do to the timing of a trial for former President Trump. There are many other cases pending related to January 6th at that very federal courthouse. Catch us up, please.
Getting this trial back on the calendar is going to be tricky. Timing is everything. The judges here have a very full dance card, Major, including Judge Chutkin. Why? Because there remain hundreds of other January 6 cases, some of which are on trial here today.
And Scott, thank you very much for that. Jan, very quickly before we get off the air, later this week, the Supreme Court, which would rather not be embroiled in some of these underlying contentious issues, will hear arguments on the 14th Amendment case.
And the 14th Amendment case is a legal terminology for basically saying, is Donald Trump going to be able to run for president? I mean, that is really the bottom line on that case. Can states remove him from the ballot because he was a, quote, insurrectionist? It's harder to see how the stakes can be higher for a presidential election than that case.
And you'll be with us on that Thursday coverage as well. Jan Crawford, Robert Costa, Scott McFarland, my thanks to Jessica Levinson. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and of course on tonight's CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Good day.
All right. Well, you just heard that CBS News Special Report. An appeals court in Washington, D.C. has ruled that Donald Trump does not have presidential immunity in his criminal case stemming from January 6th. So Katrina Kaufman is here in Studio 57 with us to break it all down. She's an attorney and a CBS News campaign reporter. And you have been basically on Trump court cases this sort of whole time. So this is what you've been waiting for. You've been sort of going through the decision. It's 50-odd pages. What's standing out to you?
I've only had kind of a moment to have a cursory look at this, but I mean, basically, they affirm that when Trump left office, he lost the protection of the presidency. He lost the protection of presidential immunity. So this claim that he made, it just no longer stands. And it felt very clear sitting in the courtroom when this appeal was going on in Washington, D.C., that the judges were very skeptical of this argument. President Trump's claim that almost no matter what he did, he would be protected from prosecution. And so, yes,
a quick quote that reinforces what you're saying right there. And the quote is, for the purpose of this criminal case, former President Trump has been citizen Trump with all of the defenses of any other criminal defendant. But any executive immunity that may have protected him while he served as president, it no longer protects him against this prosecution.
Absolutely. And the other thing that stands out to me is they basically say that it would destroy the separation of powers in the United States. We have a system of checks and balances. The president is not supposed to be superior to all things. The court has to be a check on him as well.
So let's look at page 20, Katrina, because I think that's interesting of this ruling. And this is what the president's lawyers argued. And they argued, as you just stated, that there's a separation of powers, which means that neither a federal nor a state prosecutor nor a state or federal court may sit in judgment over a president's official acts which are vested in the presidency alone. But the court, which says that the president and his lawyers relied on Marbury versus Madison, says that they got it wrong or they misread this case. Properly understood, the court writes, the separation of powers doctrine may immunize lawful discretionary acts, but does not bar the federal criminal prosecution of a former president for every, and they emphasize every, official act. What does that mean to you?
That they won't immunize the president for every official act. I mean, I think even if you look back to President Nixon, for example, he was pardoned because he could have potentially been found liable for the crimes of Watergate. So I think that this is an example of that. Even if something takes place while you're in office, there is the potential that when you leave office that you could be prosecuted for those crimes.
So, right, because that's sort of the way I read it, and I'm not a lawyer, but we talked about the fact that he is now citizen Trump, and that's how the court sees him. But this is also suggesting that even when he commits an illegal act or an act that can be prosecuted as president, you're not covered under Marbury versus Madison, which is what the president's lawyers argued.
Yeah, and I think that was evident during the questioning of the immunity appeal as well. I remember Justice Florence Pan, she asked that question that I think has now been quoted many times, can you ask SEAL Team 6 to kill a political rival while you're in office? And then there's no consequence for that. So I think this is just to show, yes, he is now a citizen, but even as president, I mean, you don't have full reign to do whatever you want.
So then what does this mean for this case? This is the insurrection case, the January 6th insurrection case, that there are many, many other people who have gone to court and been sentenced for their participation in what happened on January 6th. It was on the calendar for March 4th, I believe, and then mysteriously disappeared. What now?
Sure. I mean, I think it was inevitable that March 4th just wasn't going to work at this point because basically for every day this trial has been delayed, there is pretrial activity that needs to resume. I think now I'd have to look at the timeline, but spring seems like a realistic option. I know that Judge Chutkan has some things on the docket for early April, and also this order does say that Trump has until February 12th to appeal to the Supreme Court.
Right.
So that is a step where we'll have to see what happens with that. But, you know, I do think now it is more and more likely that this case is going to move forward, and it could move forward in the very near future.
And he would have to stand trial for his connection to an alleged insurrection.
So
right?
I want to talk to congressional correspondent Scott McFarlane about that very point. He's been following this case. He's outside the courthouse in Washington now. Scott, you probably heard Anne-Marie and Katrina talking about possible dates for this case, which would be well before the presidential election. What do you make of that?
Timing was everything for this appeals court ruling. There were some impatient folks waiting the month it took between oral arguments and this ruling. But what the appeals court has done has really set the table for this trial getting back on the calendar as early as this spring. The initial trial date you mentioned was March 4th. CBS News was first to report that that trial date disappeared off the court calendar last week as the judge in the case waited for this appeals court ruling to come back. As of next week, this case could go back to the authority of the district court judge, Judge Tanya Chutkan, who has spoken in court about the need to get this thing done promptly because, in her words, Donald Trump is just any other criminal defendant and does not deserve special privileges. But there's a logistical issue here. How do you get a trial date for a potentially 6-week trial with all the unique security protocols that are going to be needed back on the calendar of a courthouse that is a very, very full courthouse? There are 1,200 plus January 6 cases, much less the other cases in D.C. that are going through the court. Now, the judge will have next week the ability to put it back on the calendar. There is certainly some time available for the election, but it's narrow. And if the appeals court had waited weeks longer or months longer before returning this ruling, it may have been impossible to get back on the calendar before the election. Now it's very much possible, if not overwhelmingly likely.
You know, the president has had kind of loss after loss. You know, he lost the E. Jean Carroll case, and he's lost this case. We learned earlier this week that, you know, $50 million of donated money has been spent on his defenses. And as you point out, Scott, this case is I mean, we haven't even started really with this case. Yet, you know, I expect an email is going to be going out.
Fundraiser.
If it hasn't already, appealing to donors for more support. You know, can we expect, though this seems like a really clear loss, but can we expect the former president to be using this as part of his campaign, as he has with every other case?
If past his prologue, absolutely. Not only is it a fundraising tool, it's proven to be a very effective fundraising tool. But here's the bottom line. I don't think people have a proper appreciation for the size and scope of what this trial would be, the spectacle it would be. Unlike those cases in New York, those civil cases, he can't come and go as he pleases. He's a criminal defendant. He would have to be here in the court every day for weeks at a time. That in itself is a spectacle. What's more, this case with tethers to January 6th and efforts to overturn the election is the case with which Americans are most familiar. This is not an obscure classified records case, or it doesn't involve hush money or civil law. This involves January 6th and the efforts to subvert an election, things people watched on live television. It has the potential for jaw-dropping, visceral moments. And it's going to play out over the course of weeks, not days. It's going to shutter much of the nation's capital for security reasons. It's going to be a true spectacle. And this appeals court ruling sets the table for it, you know, actually happening before the election, which was in question during these appeals.
So let me ask you then, Scott, for those members of Congress that you've been speaking to, who have already thrown their support to President Trump, in some cases have endorsed him, will this give them pause? Because there are a number of people who have wondered, why is Nikki Haley still in this race, given that the RNC the former president, his supporters, his sycophants have all said that he's all but locked up the nomination. If you are somebody who's thrown the endorsement to President Trump, will this give you pause? And if you're somebody who has not yet endorsed either Haley or Trump, if you're Nikki Haley, do you see this, as terrible as it is for this country to be going through a situation that the one you just described, as a small light at the end of the tunnel?
We haven't really seen the filing of the criminal charges or the pre-trial motions in this criminal case or the others dent Donald Trump's political support, and there's really a shrinking number of members of Congress who've yet to endorse him. And those who've endorsed him include the leaders, all of them, in the U.S. House, much of the senior Senate Republicans in the Senate Republican caucus. But at a minimum, a trial and how it plays out, a verdict in a trial, if it happens before Election Day, has the potential of being a game-changing moment, but there's been no indications yet to guarantee that's true.
All right. Scott MacFarlane for us outside that D.C. courthouse. If you're just joining us, former President Trump has been denied in his immunity appeal in the January 6th case. Scott, thank you very much. Let's bring in Tom Dupree for analysis. He was a principal deputy assistant attorney general under the George W. Bush administration. Sir, thanks so much for joining us. Again, we have been dissecting this 57-page ruling, and what people are going to want to know, those folks who are at home watching this and are watching this on their phones in the middle of their workday when they just want to understand what this ruling means. How is the court viewing former President Trump's claim that he has immunity for anything that he does, that he did while he was in office or even out of office?
Well, they rejected that claim across the board. They basically said that former President Trump, for present purposes, is citizen Donald Trump, and he enjoys no greater protection against criminal prosecution than any other citizen of the United States. The opinion is somewhat of a tour de force. It's a long opinion. It's nearly 60 pages. The three judges reached unanimity, so there are no dissents. And the court did a fairly deep dive into both history, into constitutional text and structure, into the policy arguments that underlie both sides' cases. But at the end of the day, their ultimate bottom line was very clear. Former President Trump is not immune from criminal prosecution for activities he took when he was president.
And then, so moving forward, where does the actual case go from here? This is the case about his involvement in the January 6th insurrection.
Right. From here, the next likely stop would be the United States Supreme Court. The ball is in former President Trump's court at the moment. Mm-hmm. He has the right, and I suspect he will exercise the right, to appeal this decision to the United States Supreme Court. He's on a fairly quick timeline. The D.C. Circuit, the appellate court today, said that they need him to make his decision in about a week or so, whether he's going to try to get this case into the Supreme Court. Keep in mind, the United States Supreme Court doesn't have to accept this case for review. In fact, they declined to take most cases that are presented with them. So it's not a sure bet that the United States Supreme Court is going to want to grant review and is going to want to hear this case. But that's really the last stop in the train for former President Trump, at least at this point in time.
And then based on, and I know, everyone's just getting this 57-page document, but on what grounds would they be able to appeal to the Supreme Court? You can't just say, I don't like the results of this. I want someone else to look at it. There has to be a reason, right? Do you see anything in there?
Sure. I think what the former President Trump's lawyers would argue are a few things. One is that they would argue that the Court of Appeals simply misread the Constitution, that in their view, at least, presidents need to be granted this sort of immunity in order to do their job. I'm not saying that's a winning argument, but at least that's the argument they are likely to make, that the Court of Appeals basically bollocksed up the Constitution and got it wrong. The other thing I think they'll say is just the importance and the gravity of this case. That's something that the Supreme Court thinks about when deciding whether it wants to take a case, is how important is this case to the legal structure and to the country as a whole? And on that front, obviously, they can say this is about as important as a case gets, and it's definitely something in their view that would be worthy of Supreme Court review.
One of the things that I would love your take on, which is what a Republican who served in multiple administrations said about where the former president wanted folks to understand what he was trying to get at. And her name is Karen Henderson. She wrote this: I think it's paradoxical to say that his constitutional duty meaning the former president, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed allows him to violate criminal laws. Can you, again, it's pretty plain here, but I want people who are tuning in to understand why somebody who perhaps is a supporter of the GOP would suggest that what the former president is asking is absurd.
Right. Well, I think what that point gets at, and Judge Henderson is someone who comes from a Republican background and may well be politically supportive of the former president. And what she's basically saying is that under our Constitution, the president does have a requirement, a duty to take care that the laws of the United States be faithfully executed. And that was the basis for former President Trump's argument as to why he should be immune, that if he didn't have immunity, he couldn't execute that duty. And so what she did was she basically turned around that constitutional text on him and said, look, the right or the duty to take care that our laws are faithfully executed doesn't give you a license to defy and disregard those laws in your own personal conduct. So I think it was her way of saying, look, yes, you're quoting the Constitution correctly, but it doesn't quite mean what you think it means.
So according to what I've read, and again, I always preface it that Anne-Marie and I are not lawyers, but the impeachment claim that the former president made, he seemed to rely on this one line in the Constitution saying that while Congress can only remove a person from office, and this is the line, the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment. So he had argued that that must mean the opposite is also true, that a president who is not convicted may not be subject to criminal prosecution. What did Judge Chutkan say to that argument, if you recall?
Oh, I recall very well. She didn't buy that argument. And look, that's what the former president's lawyers had been arguing. They had basically said that unless you're actually impeached and then convicted by the Senate, you can't stand trial on these criminal charges because in their view, at least, you've effectively been acquitted through the constitutionally prescribed procedure. She said not so fast. She said the actual clause of the Constitution simply says that, yes, you can be subject to impeachment proceedings, but whenever that is done, and if you're out of office, that doesn't preclude the possibility of a subsequent criminal proceeding against you. So there you had a disagreement as to what the constitutional text meant, and the district court basically rebuffed and rejected the former president's arguments.
I want to ask you a little bit about sort of the full philosophy behind the argument, right? Which is basically, and this is going to be me and regular people speak, right? Which is basically when you're the president, you got to make tough decisions at times. And some of those decisions may harm people. They may appear criminal. If you weren't a president, they perhaps would be. You wouldn't be given leeway. But you have to have some sort of protection. And I think he brought up police officers and maybe even priests or something along those lines. He brought up
he brought up priests.
Yeah, sorry. So that was part of the argument that it's tough to be the president, and if you're always considering that you may be sued or you may be charged later on, you won't be able to make those tough decisions.
Yeah, well, look, for a non-lawyer, you articulated that argument very well. That's exactly what they were arguing. They were basically saying that, look, if you subject the president to possible criminal liability, they're going to be looking over their shoulder every day. They're not going to be able to execute the duties of their office. If, for example, they ordered a military strike on someone, God forbid, years later, someone could say, well, that actually violated the law and you need to be prosecuted for that. So that was what they were saying. You can't have a president doing his or her job if they are saddled with the possibility of criminal liability. Now, the counter argument to that, and I think what a lot of Judge Chutkan and the D.C. Circuit in today's opinion were grappling with, is to say, look, we don't want to hobble presidents and their ability to do their job, but at the same time, it's not asking too much to say that the president, like any other American, needs to follow the law. And yes, you have to have protection so that presidents aren't sued with, hundreds of frivolous lawsuits the moment they leave office. But at the same time, no one is above the law in the United States, and it's not asking too much of our presidents to demand that they conform their conduct to the requirements of the law.
So, Tom, there was something else that sort of was interesting as a student of history that I noted, which is that Judge Michelle Childs noted during the oral argument phase that after resigning the presidency, Richard Nixon received a pardon, right? We famously, Gerald Ford pardoned President Nixon for any criminal activity. And the line was, this is the quote, any criminal activity, quote, he may or may have committed or may have committed. So wouldn't that mean that that precedent is set that there's an acceptance there that you could have been charged with a crime had President Ford not given you this pardon. Am I wrong in thinking that way?
No, that's I think exactly the argument that the opponents of President Trump were making is they basically were saying, well, if you're right about this, then President Nixon didn't need a pardon after all. It was all for nothing, that he was immune anyways. So that can't be right. And look, I think that's one of the fascinating aspects of this case is that you can draw upon history. You can look to historic precedents from our nation's history and our traditions as to what the scope of this immunity, if it exists, really is. And I think a lot of folks like you did have looked back to an arguably analogous situation after former President Nixon left office and got a pardon and said, well, if presidents were truly immune, there was no need for President Ford to have done this. So again, it's a good historic argument, and I think one that the D.C. Circuit, at least in part, embraced today.
So the D.C. Circuit ruling, as you know, Tom, is not binding in any other jurisdiction where President Trump is accused of a crime. He's making similar arguments in Georgia, where he's accused of interfering in that state's 2020 election. But in that case, the former president is arguing around the supremacy clause, which bars state prosecutors from indicting a former president. Even though this ruling is not binding in other states, can the judges in Georgia look to this ruling for guidance?
Yes, great question. And the short answer is yes, they can look to it for guidance, and I am confident they will look to it for guidance. The way that lawyers would describe this is, you're right, it's not binding on other courts outside of Washington, D.C., but it's what lawyers and courts and judges would refer to as persuasive authority. In other words, it's another court, I should note, a highly respected court, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, that reached this decision on presidential immunity. And does the court in Georgia absolutely have to follow and accept that decision? Technically, no. But I think that they will read it, they'll see that it's a seriously reasoned decision, and they'll probably give it great weight, if not controlling weight.
So say this trial gets postponed and Trump wins in November. Is he protected? Could he, preemptively pardon himself?
Well, if Trump wins in November and this case, the January 6th case in D.C., is still going, I think at that point, the legal world changes. The moment that President Trump, if he's reelected, is inaugurated, he has the power and the authority to direct the Justice Department to immediately drop the prosecution. I don't think there's much debate that he has the power to do that. As the chief executive, he oversees and controls the Justice Department. He controls their prosecution decisions, and there's nothing that would stop him from directing the Attorney General to immediately drop that prosecution. If we're in a world where he had been convicted before the election, but then after the election he comes into office, I think it's an open question whether or not a president could actually pardon himself. And I suspect if he tried to do that, I think that is a case that likely would work its way up to the United States Supreme Court for decision.
Right, but
it's not something that's ever been decided in our nation's history.
Yeah, but Tom, I can't even believe we're having this conversation.
I know, but Tom, he wouldn't need to pardon himself, right, if he's elected president. He could just say,
if he was already convicted.
Yeah, but he would still be president of the United States.
Yeah, but if he's convicted, he's going to face a sentencing of some sort. So he would have to pardon himself so he wouldn't have to face that.
That's interesting.
Exactly. This is crazy.
Yeah. we're uncharted constitutional territory here.
Yes, indeed. Tom Dupree, this has been really insightful and very clear. Certainly for our viewers who are just tuning in, who are following along with the story, Tom, we so appreciate your insight. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm sure he's very thankful that we have.
So we're going to take a quick break. But on the other side, we're going to keep up this conversation, dig a little deeper. Stick around.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just keep going?
What's wrong with that argument?
What have you learned?
Do you know why?
Why?
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS. An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish that you and I are going to have.
Yep.
Oh, my God.
Is it good? Mm-hmm. Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
If we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
On 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. It's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
It can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7. That is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable.
The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
Human remains found this week.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
How can we become our best selves? That may be more about character than talent.
The ultimate mark of your potential is how far you've climbed, not how high you've gone.
Realizing your true potential with Adam Grant as we go person to person.
So there we go. A Washington, D.C. appeals court has ruled that Donald Trump does not have presidential immunity in his criminal case stemming from the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Katrina Kaufman is here in Studio 57 with us. Sorry, Katrina's still scrolling through everything. She quickly looked up. She's an attorney and a CBS News campaign reporter. So I don't know how much you've been able to digest because it's a 57-page document here. But, what has jumped out to you about the conclusion, the unanimous conclusion that the judges came to?
I mean, I think one important thing is something they say at the end, which is they say, we have balanced former President Trump's asserted interests in executive immunity against the vital public interests that favor allowing this prosecution to proceed. And this really was a balance that they were trying to figure out in these arguments, which is, the public interest in really weighing these crimes that are being charged in this January 6th case in Washington, D.C., in the potential harm of making the president immune from all criminal prosecution. I mean, there is protection from civil liability, but this was the first time that it had been considered whether criminal liability would be extended to the president, criminal immunity would be extended to the president as well. And I think that they just view this as too dangerous territory for the United States, for the balance of power here. And as a matter of public policy, they feel that they can't allow him presidential immunity and that they need to let this case move forward.
Were you surprised by the ruling?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Sitting in that room, I think it felt, I guess you never really know what people are thinking, but it felt very evident that these three judges were really skeptical of his arguments. I mean, they also, there's also the double jeopardy argument as well. And just even the one conservative judge on this panel just said that, it countervails the president's duty to take care of the laws to allow this type of immunity. And even when President Trump wasn't impeached, a lot of these senators, they weren't saying that he wasn't immune from criminal prosecution. They were just saying that they didn't think that this was what should happen at the time. And some of them even seemed to think that, he would have potential criminal liability later when they made that call. So the principle of double jeopardy just really doesn't apply here either.
And do you think then, you heard our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, say that it will be, if this case is kicked up to the Supreme Court, that it will be very difficult for the former president to get even those conservative justices on the same page. Again, it's sort of what Tom was saying in our last segment, right? I mean, if you are a judge, regardless of your political affiliation, you're looking at all this evidence and you're seeing judge after judge after judge ruling in this way, even if you are the ultimate law of the land, which the Supreme Court is. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible the Supreme Court won't even take this
it up.
case.
So wait, if it doesn't take it up, what does that mean?
That means the case
this is it.
This would be it. And I think another interesting thing is that in this judgment or the order that they released today, they said that if he appeals to the Supreme Court by February 12th, then the case remains on hold while the Supreme Court makes the decision. But I believe they said that if he tries to appeal en banc, which would be to the full D.C. appeal circuit, that does not keep the case on hold. So I think they're basically trying to make it so he'll skip that step.
Right, or else he could go from like one baby step to another baby step, and then it's like this case just gets extended almost indefinitely.
Yeah, they're saying the mandate will stay if you appeal to the Supreme Court by the 12th, but if you appeal to en banc, then it won't. So I think they are trying to really move this along. We saw their expedited argument schedule. I think everyone felt that maybe they were taking their time on this opinion, but really this is still quite fast for the appeals court.
So the Supreme Court, if they choose not to take this case up, you're essentially sending the message that the D.C. court ruled correctly.
If they don't take it up, they would be essentially affirming the ruling.
Yep.
Or would it be that whatever Trump's lawyers' arguments were to justify the Supreme Court taking it up just wasn't a strong enough argument, and they have to find a better argument?
I mean, you could say that too.
Okay.
That's possible. But they would be denying cert. I mean, I guess we'll see it. It's hard to predict what's going to happen anymore these days. We are already going to watch the Supreme Court listen to the 14th Amendment argument this Thursday as well. So there are just so many of these President Donald Trump cases at their doorstep. So we'll have to see which ones they want to weigh in on and which ones they want to just let stand as they are.
All right, Katrina Kaufman, really great to have you here on set because this is it's so interesting. On one hand, you read it's 57 pages, so it's a very deep ruling. But as non-lawyers, you're sort of looking at it and you're going, they seem to be making it very clear.
Yes.
And it's the stuff that you learned in 7th grade, like civics classes about the Constitution, right?
It's very clear that, and really part of their argument is, well, where would it end?
Right.
If not this, then what else could you do while you were in office?
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. Thank you very much, Katrina.
Thank
Appreciate
you for having me.
All right, our coverage will continue in our next hour. CBS News election law contributor David Becker will be here with more analysis. Stay with us.
We are about to see American weapons in the hands of Mexican cartels.
A gun pipeline to Mexico.
We are arming the cartels.
100%, no doubt about it.
Happening right under our noses.
Who's doing something about this? Nobody.
A CBS Reports exclusive.
Most Americans have no idea that we are effectively arming the enemy next door.
This is the story the American people need to know.
Arming cartels. Now streaming on the free CBS News app. People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell.
We aim every night to be factual and fair. That's our goal.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Imagine yourself in Manhattan with no police, no army, no mayor.
The people of Haiti stare down poverty, corruption, natural disasters, and violence.
90% of the guns that are used by gangs in Haiti are American guns.
but with an unbreakable spirit and eternal optimism.
There are days where I cry, but we can't be discouraged. We still believe in Haiti.
They're still able to look ahead with hope.
Haiti is on the brink of transformation, a radical shift. Haitians are coming together and saying things must change.
Fighting for Haiti, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Since childhood, she never stopped reaching for the skies. Now she's spent more time in space than any other American.
I like being a part of something bigger than me.
Peggy Whitson's extraordinary career as a history-making astronaut when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're gonna tell you about that too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Our story's just begun.
Why did you want to share your story?
Water up this high?
Where are these coming from?
That's the million-dollar question.
I'm a very curious person. I wake up every morning asking, what's happening in the world? Why is this happening? And how do we answer that question on the CBS Evening News?
We have a lot more news ahead. We are following this major appeals court ruling in Donald Trump's federal election interference case, and we are also watching the weather out west, the storm system causing havoc. That it is not over yet, as you can see by the mess in the what is that?
Radar.
Thank you very much. We have a look at all the damage left behind in the areas that could see flooding and heavy snow. So stay with us.
The grief of losing a child is immense. You can't breathe.
After decades of the war on drugs, things have only gotten worse.
Every shipment of fentanyl is a ticking time bomb.
50 times more powerful than heroin.
CBS Reports goes deep into Mexico.
What is your role in the Sinaloa cartel?
To find out why the cartels keep getting stronger and wealthier.
This is a war, but we're not fighting it. Our citizens are dying.
Funding Cartels, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides, Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
This is CBS.
The justices ruled that Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution.
In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, uncertainty sets in for some students of color.
Affirmative action really gave us an equal opportunity.
CBS Reports explores the historic decision and what it means for those chasing an opportunity to change their lives.
I knew that college was the ticket to break this cycle.
The end of affirmative action, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme.
The threat of severe storms and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last
the 7th straight day of terrifying weather.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News.
The film we'd set out to make was a story of a comedy superstar turned president.
There's currently a major Russian buildup.
The war in Ukraine has begun.
We are looking at people who want to live in our country.
Everything that happens here is going to affect every other place in the world.
When stakes are so high, we will keep fighting.
You were born for this moment.
I'm ready to win.
CBS News, 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS. CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
CBS Morning.
Your morning routine just got better.
I love that.
CBS Morning.
All right, so it is 11 a.m. Eastern here in New York City and in Washington, D.C., of course, where an appeals court has ruled that Donald Trump does not have presidential immunity in his criminal case stemming from January 6th. Earlier, we spoke with Scott McFarlane, he's right outside of the courtroom there, about what this all means for the looming court case.
As of next week, this case could go back to the authority of the district court judge, Judge Tanya Chutkin, who has spoken in court about the need to get this thing done promptly because, in her words, Donald Trump is just any other criminal defendant and does not deserve special privileges. But there's a logistical issue here. How do you get a trial date for a potentially 6-week trial with all the unique security protocols that are going to be needed back on the calendar of a courthouse that is a very, very full courthouse? There are 1,200 plus January 6 cases, much less the other cases in D.C. that are going through the court. Now, the judge will have next week the ability to put it back on the calendar. There is certainly some time available for the election, but it's narrow. And if the appeals court had waited weeks longer or months longer before returning this ruling, it may have been impossible to get back on the calendar before the election. Now it's very much possible, if not overwhelmingly likely.
A massive storm system has turned deadly in California. Millions around the state faced flash flooding and power outages after record-breaking mudslides crashed through people's homes, and many had to be rescued after getting trapped by rising waters. At least 3 people have died. Jonathan Bigliotti has a look at the damage and what's ahead for residents.
Literally, it just happened in 3 seconds. Rumbling, big bang,